Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Welcome back, friends, to the Rewind podcast here at Forward Church. Joined here by Steve Adams, our global engagement and teaching pastor here at Forward. So Steve, you were tasked with wrapping up our past series, or just the end of it here was we looked at the words of Jesus post-resurrection and pre-ascension. Wrapped up with this idea of being sent as his witnesses, which I thought, I've actually found it really challenging to come up with really good questions because I felt like you were so clear through the message, which I suppose is a good thing, right?
Ideally, I think.
Now, what I couldn't help but think of was you started off by saying like, hey, some of you guys, this is going to be a little bit of a minor adjustment, tweaking the dials, but some of you guys, this is going to be a wild reorientation of your life if you really take these words of Jesus seriously. Because that was your story, right? You and Cheryl have been through this whole Jesus grabbing your life and flipping it upside down. Do you want to walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think as pastors, a friend of mine early in the ministry told me, he said, there's too many traffic cops that preach. And what he meant by that was, this dates me a little bit, but back in the day, you still see them once in a while in Britain and places, but, a traffic cop is a guy that's standing still, but he's pointing everybody else which way to go. And so I'm always hesitant to preach on things that, to proclaim unlived experience. So I don't have any problem because we had a major redirection of our lives. I was owned a small business, and Cheryl had a career in advertising, and I would say we were cultural Christians living kind of the good life, if you will, and had a very nice home and new cars and, a couple or three trips every year, and that was kind of it. And so the Lord had different plans in store for us, and through the series of really just kind of miraculous events where, it was obviously the hand of God. We just were convinced that we were supposed to do something different, and He orchestrated that. And, I think there was a time in my life, Andrew, and I think Christians should really give some careful thought to this, that, when we think of our responsibility, and we're stewards of the gospel, I mean, and that what privilege that is, but what responsibility does that bring? Because we have been given this message, and biblically it's in jars of clay. We're very broken, imperfect people, but God in His providential plan has decided that we would be His ambassadors. And at some point we have to make a decision to say to ourselves, Are we willing to go but planning to stay, or are we planning to go and willing to stay? In other words, is there a fulcrum where that balance should tip, and we'll say, no, we're going to go unless God holds us back, which is different than saying, well, if God wants me to do something, yeah, I'll do it. But, right now I'm just planning on this. And we came to that place in our lives, and then God responded very quickly in response to that changed perspective. And were we fearful? Without a doubt. At times we were fearful. Was it all a panacea? Was everything good? No, the first ministry we went to serve at, we got there within a few weeks. We realized that there was some really challenging dynamics within the ministry. And 6 months later, the whole ministry imploded. And the 12 staff members, 7 left, including some very good friends. And so, that was difficult. But through all of that, we believe very much that God called us to do this. Now, having said that, I also reject this idea that if, you're serving God in the marketplace of life, that there's that's some kind of a lower calling, or there's less spirituality. Having said that, I think we've greatly diminished the kingdom role in the marketplace. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So
Wonderful. Yeah, and we got to reap the benefits of you coming back, having been seasoned in ministry, and then you got to lead us here for a dozen or so years as Forward Church, which is amazing. And what you're doing now really ties into that. You've done global engagement stuff, and one of the things you did down south was run a missions organization. So we're gleaning from that here at Forward Church as well. And then one of the things you're also doing is this For the City movement. And I'd love, maybe some of our Forward friends aren't as familiar with your work there. Would you just sort of help us to understand what it is that you're doing as the For the City?
Sure. So a lot of people have, heard that I'm involved in Cambridge Neighborhood Table, which I'm part of the Startup Leadership Advisory Council for that. I'm one of 4 people. And so that's part of what I'm doing. But a lot of people think I left Forward to, feed homeless people or whatever. As honorable as that is, that's just a little piece of a much bigger puzzle. But I came to the conclusion a few years ago, as a pastor of, one of the largest churches in the city, that, we needed to set the pace, and I needed to set the pace, and that I had always in my pastoral ministry felt that God's blessing, as we experienced it Forward, brought to us a responsibility to bless other churches, especially smaller churches, because God uses a lot of different things in the building of his kingdom. And so we always tried to resource other churches and churches that were new and churches that were being revitalized. And so we really just really tried to embrace that. So I've tried to embrace that in my personal ministry, in encouraging pastors and providing resources and, letting them use things that we had and things that, I'd done. Say, just put your name on it and use it. This is for the kingdom. There's no ownership issues in this. But I thought that needed to be formalized. There was no sort of umbrella group under which the people of God were coming together for the common good of our city. And I'm deeply connected to this city. I was born here. Cheryl was born here. My mom was born here. My dad was born in Guelph, but my mom was born here. My sister was born here. My family is deeply involved. My mother was involved in politics here and in the media, wrote a column in the newspaper and had a radio program. And my father ran a business here. And so, I just feel deeply connected to this city. When I was a teenager, I actually worked for 2 mayors of the city. I don't know. That's my 15 minutes of fame, I guess. But I've just had this great connect and care for this city. And so I felt that, that we are called to, be a blessing in the place where God plants us. And so we decided to formalize that and pull God's people together. And in a way that if people would stand up and say, Jesus Christ is King, then we could do some things together, even though we might have different color carpet and important theological things like that. But so that's what we've done, and I had the blessing of founding that, and I'm still giving leadership to it. But it's churches. And the other thing we have a lot of here, and often people in churches don't realize this, we have a lot of Christian ministries that are based here doing amazing work. I don't want to start naming them because there's too many and I'll forget some, but there's a number of them that are just amazing groups and doing work both here in the community and really around the world. But all of that is sort of lighthoused out of this city. And so they're part of this. And so I think we've got about, between churches and organizations, probably 30 groups that are participating. And we want to do some things. And in fact, we were planning some things this fall, but of course, everything kind of got sidetracked a bit. But you're going to hear more from us. And my desire is to put more energy into that. I think when the spiritual tide goes up, of course, it lifts everybody's boat. And so that's the people who are part of this get that and they understand that. And so we've got, Christian Reformed and Baptists and Pentecostals and Anglicans and United Church folk and, and everything. And we're trying to say, that Christ matters in the life of a city. And so that's kind of what it's about.
Would you just sort of, as we wrap this section up here, give us one or two things that you have done and maybe one or two things that you're looking ahead to do. I know everybody's plans are super tentative in this moment, but just sort of a dream that you may have.
Yeah. So one of the things we've done, and a number of churches got involved in this at varying degrees, but we've participated in a thing that we started called Pray and Go, which was people taking door hangers and just going and praying over their neighborhood. And, I've always told people, I'm sort of a proclamation evangelist probably at heart as much as I am anything. And I've always said, talk to God about your neighbors before you talk to your neighbors about God. And so this gives people an opportunity to go and just pray over their neighborhood, pray over the apartments in their apartment building or their townhouse complex or wherever they live. And just to put a door hanger that just says, we love you, we care about you. And if there's anything we can do, and some people would sign those and put, this is our phone number if they felt comfortable doing that, or my email. Or we live at 52 Maple Street or whatever, and we're neighbors. And so we distributed several thousand of those last Easter. We distributed a bunch last Christmas, this Easter. And then some churches got quite involved as COVID-19 started to ramp up, and we had a bunch of people do their neighborhoods and got really good responses. But then we felt people are getting more and more concerned about people coming to their door, to their house. So we thought, but we'll ramp that up again. So that's one of the things. We meet monthly, and anybody's welcome to come to those monthly meetings. You don't have to be a church staff member or a pastor or a minister. If you're a person who's concerned about the spiritual good of our city and what we can do together, you're welcome. And so we have a monthly meeting. It kind of rotates around. We bring in a speaker every month, and we've had some great speakers speak on very diverse topics. To do with all kinds of things, from mental health to, how do we minister to people who are struggling financially, to how do you stay healthy in the Christian life, especially if you are in ministry, and a number of other things talking about, what other city groups are doing. And so that's another thing. We'd really like to get the Mayor's Prayer Breakfast relaunched, which was a big thing here in town, which was just basically sent a message to the city fathers and to sort of the business community and whatnot, that the people of faith are concerned. And one of the ways we demonstrate that is through living our life of faith. And so we'd like to see that launch. We'd hope to launch that in the fall again, relaunch it, but everything's a bit tentative on that. So that's just a few things that we're working on. Yeah,
I find that super exciting. So I think that's perfect segue into where you were headed on Sunday. The area I'd like to spend the most time on is you promised us on Sunday morning that you would dig into this idea of using Monday morning as a ministry launch pad. And I know you've got some thoughts and some practical ideas around that. I'd love for you just to sort of walk us through some of that as we dig in here.
Yeah, sure. If I reflected back on my years of pastoring, and as I look at church work, and now as I'm involved in a lot of other churches, I think if there's something I would definitely do different, I would look through a little different lens. I think there's far too much church activity and energy placed into making people better church members instead of better kingdom builders. And I think those two things can be there's some similarities, but the ultimate goal is to equip soldiers for the Jesus army. And so that being said, the predominant and requisite need that they have is, how does their Christian faith intersect with the activity that most people spend the greatest percentage of their week at, other than sleeping, and that's in their vocation, their work life. And I think there's been far too little energy expended in that, and there's been this, in some regards, an unhealthy divide between the secular and the sacred. So Sunday I said there's only really two things that are required of you in the Christian life, and everything falls under these two umbrellas, and they are worship and witness. And everything you do in the Christian life, I believe, falls under those two things. And you could say, well, what about this? And I'll tell you, if you spend some time, it's either worship and witness or an intersection of the two of them, right? So thinking in those terms, what does it look like if when you go to work on Monday morning, you view your vocational life, your work life, as both worship and witness. What does that look like? How does that mean you're going to view your boss differently? Often we hear people talking about, their boss is difficult and their supervisor drives them nuts or whatever. We need to think in terms of, there's globally, there's two huge desires of the human experience. And everybody thinks that if you go around the world, that the thing the world wants more than anything, and I'm not talking about sort of the soft things that people want. I'm talking about hard realities people want. Everybody thinks it's education. That's one of the top two. You know what the other top need that the world wants sociologically? They want to work. Now, I think we think that that's sort of, like work was not cursed. Work was given before the fall. It became arduous through the fall. But, if the kingdom is coming, and that's what Jesus told us to pray, that his kingdom would come, then what does it look like if the kingdom is unfolding and that is going to take place in the 40, 50, whatever, however many hours a week you work? What does that look like if you're bringing about the kingdom of God in your vocation? So how would you view your boss then? Instead of saying, my boss is just driving me nuts, say, you know what? Praise God that I have the ability to work, which a huge percentage of the world doesn't even have. And so, that's one simple thing, right? Another thing is, all work falls under just a few categories that we should look at in terms of witness. One of the things that work does, one category you could say, is it brings about a flourishing community. And we should acknowledge that, and we should rejoice in that, right? If you work in the area of, financial, anything to do with finances, if you work in the area of education, if you work in the area of care for seniors, right? There's been a lot of talk about that. Then you are worshiping by building a flourishing community. What does that look like? And what does your work look like? How would it look like if you look through that lens? Some people do work, that brings organization to society. A guy that does landscaping brings organization to society. Nobody ever thinks about that. As does a lawyer, right? As does a guy that, a man or woman that works out on, the utility, like out on the hydro or out on, cell phone towers. People that work in insurance and bookkeeping, they bring order to our world, right? And order is a testimony to God. It's a witness to God, because God is a God of order. He's not a God of chaos. And so what if you thought in those terms, that I'm participating with God in acts of worship and witness because I bring order? Some people are involved in work that extends or expands creation. Now, what I mean by that is they take creation and then they sort of add to it in some way. And I know it sounds a bit sort of funky when you first say it, but think about people that do manufacturing. They take iron ore or metal or whatever that God's provided through his creative genius, and then they take it and they create, move it into a set of knives. Cutlery is a great blessing. Have you ever been to one of those king, whatever they are, feasts, cutlery is a great blessing. Once you've witnessed that once, you've just about seen enough of it, right? People that are involved in agricultural work, right? They're taking God's creative genius and then they're replicating it over and over and over again. That's what the farmer does. If you're in food service, if you cook food, if you're a chef, if you're a flipping hamburgers at Harvey's, you're taking God's creative genius and then you're taking that and you're developing it one step further from God's creation. That's an act of worship and witness. What if you looked at that instead of, oh man, this stinks, I work at, flipping hamburgers or whatever. Some people, they're working to actually undermine, if you will, or truncate the curse, right? If you're in law enforcement, you're doing some of that, right? If you're in justice, if you're working in a nonprofit or a charitable status, you're trying to deal with broken families in some cases, or people dealing with poverty. What you're trying to do is undermine the curse, right? And that's worship and witness. You're saying that the life could be better because the world was created better, but we're living in a fallen environment. So these are all ways that your work life becomes worship and witness. And we've got to think more strongly in those terms. If you think the only worship and witness at your work is starting a Bible study on Wednesday at lunch, as good as that may be, you're woefully going to estimate your kingdom building capacity and responsibility in light of your vocation. Simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful, and I think a lot of us just really even need that reframe, right? It's not even that you have to do anything wildly different, but I think the intentionality behind how we're doing what we're doing and the understanding of the fact that what I'm doing at my desk on a Monday morning doesn't have to be divorced between what I was doing on 24 hours early at church on Sunday.
No, what is Sunday morning? It's the pre-game talk. That's not the game. It's the pre-game talk. What's the upper room? That's not the conclusion of Jesus' ministry with those disciples. That's, okay, we've had training camp. We've had the apprenticeship thing. You've been to the University of Life. Okay, now it's Super Bowl. I'm leaving. I can't play on the field. I can't go out on the field anymore. Right? Go get them. And that's the pregame. And basically we replicate that upper room experience, hopefully, in some fashion every Sunday morning. And then it's, as my Father has sent me, so send I you. And then we're sent people, right? We're to go. And that's what we talked about on Sunday, to be a witness, whether it's across the street or across the world.
Yeah. Oh, and I love that line in particular. So if I'm a farmer, a lawyer, a landscaper, somebody trying to figure this out, and I'm like, Steve, I agree with you. Are there some practical things that you could put in the hands of our people who want to live the rest of their week differently?
Yeah, I think for sure. There's some sort of 500 feet things you should think about, and then there's some 5 feet things. I think the 500 feet things we've sort of talked about is, how does everything become worship and witness? What does that look like? And that's sort of frame of mind kind of stuff. But what if you feel, I work in an office, whatever that may be. But let's say you work in an office environment and you say, how do I live a life of worship and witness in the office? Right? Here's a practical thing. Okay. We need to understand that distraction is a tool of Satan, and it's an imminent spiritual threat to our lives. So one of the ways that we are worship and witness in the office is not to be distracted. You cannot be working in your office and be on your phone checking Facebook and social media and all of that every 10 minutes and be present. And God is a God who comes amongst us to become fully present, right? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. So a practical thing is to be fully present, right? And fully present with your people, because then you hear what's going on with them. You pick up on subtle things. People view you as present amongst them. And we've become such a distracted society. We're just so distracted, with just the noise of life. There's a fundamental thing. Another 5-foot thing, if you view your vocation as witness and worship, is this. Every single person you interact with, coworker, customer, supplier, subcontractor, whatever that is, look at them through the eyes of Jesus. Okay? What did Jesus see when he saw other people who were outside the influence of his life? He called them helpless and hopeless sheep without a shepherd. Now, I've been in lots of countries, in the Middle East, in Europe, where there's still shepherds. And I'm here to tell you, sheep that are unshepherded, they're in huge trouble, man, because they are dumb. They are just dumb. And they're going to be in trouble. And I'm not saying people are dumb, but I'm saying that the world is set to destroy people and programmed to destroy people and ding people. And so let's look at everybody and say, you know what? When Jesus looks at that person through his eyes, and think of it in every email. Some emails are annoying. Some Zoom calls are annoying. Some performance reviews, job evaluations, they're annoying. But on the other end of every one of those is a human being, right? And that human being, Andrew, we need to acknowledge is more emotional, more beautiful, more wonderful, more terrible, more complicated than we could ever imagine, because their creator was an absolute genius. And so we need to remember that. And mixed in all of that, swirling turmoil of who they are is the image of God. Now, it's in turmoil because it's been dinged by fallenness. But we need to remember to treat everybody with the dignity and respect that's required of that which is made in God's image as an act of worship and witness. And the greatest number of interactions for most of us are going to be in our work, in our vocation. Because when we get home, we interact with our family. It's the same people all the time, right? So the greatest opportunity to make a kingdom building impression is going to be found in our vocational experiences, our work experiences, right? And so that's how we have to begin to look at people, not as, a clique or a response or even a team member, as rah, rah, rah as that sound, but as a human being. They are actually being, and they're human in that they are made in the image of God in humanity, of an addition of one. And so that should speak to us differently. And that should cause us to work differently. Let me just add one more thing, Andrew. I think we need to remember that work that is done well is incredibly glorifying to God. Because everything God does, he does so well, right? So regardless of what you do it as unto the Lord, the Bible tells us. And do it the best you can. God honors that. He honors that with tremendous, tremendous favor. And, always do more than is expected of you. That's what I've always told my kids. When I've hired people, they'll say, how can I be successful in this job? I say, do more than I expect. And that's it just glorifies God, right? If you look out on a sunflower seed field in Eastern Europe, and you're just absolutely, just taken in by the beauty of it. If you've ever looked at a 50-acre sunflower seed field, when it's just like almost, it's like, is that painted? And you can say, yeah, it's painted by the Creator. Didn't he do more than he could have? And that's what we should do in our work, because that's what God always does.
Yeah. To him who is able to do immeasurably more than you could ask or imagine, right?
Amen. Absolutely. Every time.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Now, I think all of that is unbelievably helpful, and specifically for people who just need that reframe. But I get the sense that it could be a touch overwhelming. I love that you mentioned that Jesus commanded us to go and be his witnesses. It wasn't a strong suggestion. It wasn't like, if you feel like it, if you get to level 3 of Christianity, then you go and do this thing. But it's a command that each one of us as followers of Jesus is to follow, but one that we're going to need his help to fulfill. And isn't that just like Jesus?
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, over the years, I've often had parents, and I've said this before, but over the years, I've had parents say to me, I just wish my kids were worshipers. And I'm like, oh, they are. Right? And it's the same with witness. Jesus didn't say, and you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be witnesses. There's those 2 little letters in there, right? You'll be my witnesses, right? Yeah. We're all testifying to something. We're either testifying of the validity of the resurrected life and the empowering of the Spirit, which brings the fruit of the Spirit. We're either testifying to that or we're undermining that. We're either being a witness to that, or we're being, or our lives, our speech, our activities, our demeanor is discounting that, right? And, in court, lawyers always say, oh, that person's going to be a good witness. or that person's going to be a dodgy witness. I mean, that they're not going to be credible. There's no credibility to that witness. It's the same for us, right? When Jesus says, "Be my witnesses," are we going to be credible witnesses? And that's a question we have to continually ask ourselves, and then ask for God's help to be that. That's why he said, you'll receive power. And that's why I said, this is a supernatural task. It requires that kind of empowerment.
Yeah, and I think far too often, well-intentioned church people, you sort of made that distinction. Are we going to be kingdom builders, or are we going to be good church people? I think far too often, well-intentioned church people try to witness to the power of a supernatural God without his help. And yeah, as we worked through your message on Sunday, you started there, and I just felt like, man, like if we don't start there, this whole thing just feels impossible really fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was a missions guy for many years before I became a pastoral guy. And so I've sat through, more than my fair share of missions messages and conferences. I've heard Acts 1:8 preached on more times than I can imagine. And I'm always a little bit surprised when we tend to diminish. People are anxious to get to the witness part. But before you get that, you got to have the power part. The witness without the power is just people talking.
Yeah, and I think you said you pulled it back to the disciples earlier in the message too, and you said, these disciples didn't seem to want a new kingdom. They wanted an old one, an exclusive one. And I think we're sort of in a stage right now in our lives where many of us are longing for what was, right? Yeah, I wish I could go and be with those people again. I wish I could go and do things the way I used to be able to do that. And we're in a time also where anxiety is higher, and I think creating dividing lines in ways that is ultimately going to be unhelpful unless we begin to remedy that. So I think there's some helpful teaching there.
Well, yeah, let me say this, I'm saying it to me, to you, to everybody that's listening this week. Just let's think about this for 1 second. If you're alive right now and you're an adult, you're in the midst of, but you've just been part of, you've just participated, witnessed, experienced the most significant event on planet Earth, I would say, at minimum, since the First World War. I would say it's more significant than the Second World War, because in the Second World War, there was plenty of countries that never really directly affected. And the sort of the newness of the First World War on that level and the carnage was so. In 100 years, you've experienced the most significant human event. Forget about landing on the moon. 9/11 was a big deal. We know that, but mostly for a very small slice of the world population. Other things, eradication, those are all significant things. From what I understand, the COVID-19 is just, the hospitals in Africa are just starting to experience a deluge. That'll be very interesting to see what happens there, and where the capacity to serve people is, diminished. So we've experienced the greatest single event in the human experience in at least 100 years. What does that mean? Does that mean that now we are at a point that predicates us that we need to take some inventory and say, how is this going to be different? Forget about, not forget about, but set aside, I got it, just as we got on this now, I just got an email from a pastor, we're trying to restart our church and, wanted some counsel on that. That's all important. But the primary thing is, how does this not change how we do church and how this changes the fundamental question is, what does this mean to the coming of the kingdom of God? Because the Bible tells us that this gospel will be given as a testimony to all the earth, and then the end will come. And for us as Christians, as evangelicals, we believe that end is resultant in the return of Jesus, right? And the whole management of this busted world changes. And there'll be a big sign goes out the front and says, this is under new management. And everything's changed, right? And that's the book of Revelation, right? Every tear shall be wiped away. Pain and suffering will be no more. We long for that. So what is God saying to us in that he's allowed us, in spite of all the challenges, to experience the most significant global event in at least 100 years? I think that says something to us. And what does that mean? What do we do?
And I think to live those two realities that you brought before us in this season is even more powerful, right? To worship in the midst of that is a witness in and of itself, right? That we could worship a God who is firm and steady and trustworthy in the midst of situations that have nothing to do with being firm and steady and trustworthy. And I think we as churches would do well, and we as kingdom builders would do well to live a life cognizant of the fact that our witness is on full display right now.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things that this whole COVID-19 experience has showed us is that we are using, as a world, in very different ways and in different cultures, this is manifested differently, but we're using a myriad of things to try and fill an unfillable void in our life. Do you know what kind of volume Amazon has been doing for weeks?
I don't know. I imagine it would be high.
Okay, I'll tell you what they've been doing, what they've been selling. Amazon, for a number of weeks, has been selling $10,000 a second.
Sorry, what?
$10,000 a second.
Wow.
Okay, so just try and comprehend that. Every second, they're selling $10,000 in stuff. And Amazon is largely North American. My daughter lives in Australia. She says it's not that big a deal there, but it's largely North American. So North America, $10,000 a second, just in Amazon. So people are buying stuff. I met a family the other day, and they said their son is getting packages almost on a daily basis from Amazon. I said, what's he getting? They said, we don't know. Stuff. So, because he's at home, right? So we're trying to solve this insatiable appetite we have for shalom, right? The peace of God, meaning, understanding, self-awareness and security. And so there's this insatiable appetite we have, and you see that just manifested when a lot of the things that people use, sort of relationships, activities, sports, entertainment, when all of those things are eradicated, people are almost frantic, right? Past the point of, we do this because it's something we like to do, but we're trying to just fill these voids in our lives with all of these needs and wants and desires. And this is a reckoning, I believe. This is a reckoning. It's a very painful and difficult reckoning. But part of that is to us as people who identify as followers of Jesus and ambassadors for Jesus.
I think that's a great word for us to end on, man. I think that's a helpful reframing. I cannot believe those numbers, though. Like, that is mind-boggling to me. So thank you, Steve. I think you're off for a couple of weeks here, right?
I am.
So thank you for these last couple of weeks, and we look forward to doing this again sometime.
Thanks, Andrew.
To you guys who are listening here, we will see you again here next week. We'll be joined by Pastor Derek as we kick off a new series working through the book of 1 Peter. So thanks, and we will see you again.
Thanks.